The gun was already pressed against Nathan Sawyer's temple when Charlotte Finley made her choice. She stood in the middle of Redemption Creek's dusty Main Street, the late afternoon sun bleeding orange and red across the Wyoming sky, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her teeth. Reginald Holt had one thick arm wrapped around Nathan's throat, the barrel of his Colt revolver gleaming cold against the side of Nathan's head. Nathan's hands were raised, his jaw set in that particular way Charlotte had come to recognize over the past 3 months, the way he looked when he was calculating, when he was refusing to let fear show, when he was protecting someone even while he himself was in mortal danger. "You hand me those deed papers, Miss Finley," Holt growled, his voice carrying the particular ugliness of a man who had never once in his life been told no and lived to regret it. "Or I put a hole in your hired hand right here on this street, and every soul in this town watches." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the leather satchel. Inside it were the documents that proved the Finley ranch, her father's ranch, the land her mother had died loving belonged to her and not to Holt's corrupt land consortium. Inside it was everything she had left of her family, everything she had risked coming to Wyoming for. And Nathan Sawyer, the man she had hired as a foreman 3 months ago and had somehow, against every logical argument her mind could construct, fallen completely and irrevocably in love with, was going to die unless she surrendered it. "Don't you dare, Charlotte." Nathan's voice was rough, compressed by Holt's grip at his throat, but it cut through the wind like a blade. His eyes found hers across the 20 feet of packed earth between them, and what she saw in them was not fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. It was the same certainty she had seen the first night they had talked until the stars shifted overhead on her ranch porch. "Don't you dare give it to him." That was the moment she understood exactly how much trouble she was in, not from Holt, not from the gun, not from the threat of losing everything her father had built. The real danger, the one she had been running from for 3 months, was the fact that she would have handed over every deed, every paper, every acre of land without a second thought if it meant Nathan walked away alive. And that terrified her more than any man with a gun ever could. It had begun, as most things in Charlotte Finley's life had begun, with a letter. She had been in Boston when it arrived, sitting in the narrow parlor of Mrs. Alderman's boarding house on Beacon Street, wearing a dress that pinched at the ribs and listening to the rain tap against the window glass. The letter came from a lawyer named Horatio Webb in Redemption Creek, Wyoming, informing her that her father, James Archibald Finley, had passed away in his sleep on the 14th of March, 1882, and had left her, his only surviving child, the entirety of the Finley ranch, 700 acres of grassland, a main house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, and all existing livestock. Charlotte had stared at that letter for a long time. She and her father had not been close. He had sent her east to her aunt's care when she was 12, after her mother died of the fever that swept through the territory one brutal winter. He had written occasionally dutiful, brief letters about cattle prices and weather, and she had written back in the same dutiful, brief manner. She had built a life of sorts in Boston. She worked as a school teacher, she had a small circle of friends, she wore dresses that pinched at the ribs. She was 26 years old and perfectly, achingly, competent at surviving. But the letter did something to her, or perhaps it was more accurate to say it undid something. She had been in Boston long enough to forget the smell of Wyoming sage after rain, the particular blue of the sky before a summer storm, the way the land went on forever in every direction as though the world had no walls. She had forgotten those things deliberately, the way you forget things that hurt too much to carry. The letter remembered them for her. She was on a westbound train within 2 weeks, with a single trunk of practical clothing, $63 to her name, and the absolute conviction that she was making either the bravest or the most foolish decision of her life, possibly both simultaneously. She arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday in early April, stepping off the platform of the Union Pacific Line into a town that smelled of horse and wood smoke, and the particular mineral sharpness of high-country air. The town was not large, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a telegraph office, a small white church at the far end, but it had the solid, rooted feeling of a place that intended to stay. Horatio Webb, the lawyer, was a small bird-like man of about 60 with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He met her at the station and walked her to his office, where he explained, with the careful gentleness of a man delivering news he knew was going to cause problems, that while the ranch was indeed hers, there was a complication. "Reginald Holt," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "has been making offers on the surrounding properties for 2 years. He has acquired the Dunmore land to the north and the Patterson spread to the west. He has approached me 3 times regarding the Finley ranch, and each time I have informed him it is not available. He did not take those responses particularly well." "What sort of man is Holt?" Charlotte asked. Webb looked at her over his spectacles. "The sort who is accustomed to getting what he wants," he said carefully. "He has money from the railroad contracts he secured in '78, and he has a way of making things difficult for people who stand in his way. Nothing that can be proven, you understand. Fences that get cut, water sources that go dry, hired hands who find reasons to leave." Charlotte had nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And the ranch itself, what condition is it in?" "Your father kept it going, but barely. The herd is small. The hands that stayed on after his illness left after he passed. You would need to hire on immediately, and you would need someone capable." He paused. "Someone Holt's money cannot persuade." She had not fully understood what that meant until the day she rode out to the ranch, a foreman from the livery stable driving her out in a wagon, and found a man sitting on the top rail of her fence, looking at the condition of her south pasture with an expression of professional assessment so thorough it bordered on intimacy. He had not heard her coming, or if he had decided not to pretend otherwise. He was tall and lean in the way of men who spend their days in physical work, wearing a worn canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather. His face, when he turned at the sound of the wagon wheels, was angular and serious, with dark eyes that registered her arrival with a directness that was neither rude nor particularly deferential. "You must be Miss Finley," he said, climbing down from the fence with the economical grace of someone who did everything with the minimum necessary effort. "I'm Nathan Sawyer. I heard you were coming. I've been looking at your south fence line. Is that customary?" She said, looking at someone's fence without introduction. "The fence needed looking at," he said simply. 3 posts are about to give. Another hard wind and your cattle would be in the creek. What's left of them." She found out later that Nathan Sawyer had been the best ranch foreman in the county until 18 months ago, when the ranch he had managed, the Braddock spread up near Casper, was sold out from under him when old Henry Braddock died and his sons decided they wanted the money rather than the land. He had been working odd jobs since, refusing to attach himself to any operation he did not believe was worth his skill. She found out even later that he had heard, through the particular information network that exists in small western towns, that Holt was putting pressure on the Finley property, and that Nathan Sawyer had a history with Reginald Holt that went back 6 years and involved a betrayal so complete and so damaging that it had left marks Nathan carried quietly and privately, the way a man carries scars he does not mention in polite company. But that came later. On that first afternoon, Charlotte Finley stood by her wagon in the spring light of a Wyoming afternoon and looked at Nathan Sawyer, and he looked back at her, and something shifted in the air between them, something neither of them would have admitted to or possibly even consciously recognized for quite some time. "The fence needs fixing," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "Do you want a job?" He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was actually a series of calculations about her, about the ranch, about what he was agreeing to. "Yes," he said again, "I do." She paid him fair wages from the $63, which left her with considerably fewer dollars but considerably more fence posts. Nathan hired on 2 other hands by the end of the first week brothers named Eli and Cal Drummond, 19 and 22, both of whom were hard workers and cheerfully uncomplicated in a way Charlotte found deeply restful after the political intricacies of Boston school teaching. She told herself the arrangement was entirely professional. She had come to Wyoming to save her father's land, to do something with the inheritance she had neither expected nor asked for, to prove to herself that she was capable of more than a narrow parlor and a dress that pinched at the ribs. Nathan Sawyer was a means to that end, a capable, experienced foreman who knew this land and could help her build the ranch back into something viable. She told herself this with great conviction for approximately 3 weeks. The first crack in the conviction appeared on a Tuesday evening when she found Nathan sitting on the porch steps after supper, reading. She had not expected it, the reading, not the sitting, and she stopped in the doorway with her lamp in her hand, caught off guard. "What are you reading?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked up without embarrassment. "Dickens, Great Expectations. I've read it twice before." He paused. "Pip reminds me of someone I used to know, someone who thought where he came from didn't have to define where he was going." She stood there for a moment, then set her lamp on the rail post and sat down on the upper step above him, because it seemed rude not to. "Did it work out? For the person Pip reminded you of?" "Still working on it," Nathan said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness, something more honest than either, something she did not have a name for yet. They talked for 2 hours that night. About books, initially, then about Boston and Wyoming and the particular loneliness of belonging completely to neither one place nor another. Charlotte told him things she had not told anyone in years about the winter her mother died, about the long, bewildering years in Boston learning to be a person her father would not have recognized, about the guilt that had lived in her chest ever since she received his death letter, and realized she had spent 14 years waiting for a reconciliation she had never been brave enough to initiate. Nathan listened with the focused, serious attention of someone who was genuinely interested and had no agenda but to understand. He did not offer platitudes. He did not try to fix anything. When she finished talking, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Grief is strange. It doesn't always look like what you expect." "What did yours look like?" she asked before her propriety could stop her. The pause that followed was short but complete. "Like anger mostly," he said, "for a long time." She wanted to ask about what. She did not, but the question stayed with her. Holt's first move came in mid-April, 3 weeks after Charlotte arrived. One of her south fence sections was cut overnight, not blown down by wind but deliberately cut with wire cutters, a gap wide enough for 20 head of cattle to wander through into the neighboring land, which happened to be land Holt had recently purchased. She lost 4 animals before Nathan found the gap at dawn and drove the others back. Nathan stood looking at the cut wire with his jaw doing that particular thing Charlotte had already begun to recognize. "This wasn't weather," he said. "No," she agreed. He looked at her. "This is the beginning of something, Charlotte, not an isolated incident." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice a sound that was not there before, a new note in the ambient music of a place. "I know," she said. "Webb warned me." "Webb knows a lot," Nathan said carefully. "Holt has a long reach. He has the sheriff in his pocket, or at least, Sheriff Crane is the kind of man who doesn't look hard at things that don't benefit him to see." "Do you know Holt?" she asked. Another pause. "I know of him," Nathan said, in the tone of a man choosing his words with great precision. She filed this away. She was very good at filing things away. It was, she reflected, something of a defense mechanism. May came in with warmth and the kind of wide-open sky days that made Charlotte understand, viscerally and without argument, why her father had stayed on this land for 30 years. She was beginning to know the ranch in the way you can only know a place by working it, by riding every fence line, checking every water source, knowing which cows were pregnant and which were likely to be trouble. Nathan taught her things patiently and without condescension: how to read weather in the cloud formations, how to tell a healthy steer from one that needed attention, how to rope a fence post correctly so it would hold. She was not a quick student with the physical skills. She was, however, an absolutely relentless one. Nathan seemed to appreciate this. He never laughed at her failures and never let her quit after them. "You don't have to do all of this yourself," he told her one afternoon after she had spent 40 minutes trying to master a knot that he had demonstrated 3 times. "You have hands." "I know," she said, refusing to look up from the rope, "but I want to understand everything about this place. Every part of it. I don't want to own something I don't understand." He was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual," he said. "Most owners I've worked for wanted the outcome, not the process." "Did that bother you?" "Yes," he said simply. "It did." She finally got the knot right. It was not particularly graceful, but it held. She looked up to find Nathan watching her with an expression that did something complicated to her chest, something warm and expansive, that she immediately tried to categorize as professional satisfaction or perhaps simple human camaraderie, and failed at categorizing, and tucked away to think about later. There was a particular tree at the eastern edge of the property, an enormous cottonwood growing beside a bend in the creek, that Charlotte had climbed as a child during the summers she had spent on the ranch before her mother died. She found herself going there in the evenings sometimes when the day's work was done, sitting in the grass at its base, listening to the water, letting herself feel the particular quality of peace that had once made this place feel like the safest in the world. One evening in late May, Nathan found her there. He did not say anything immediately, just sat down a respectful distance away and was quiet with her, which was something she had not experienced from another adult in so long that it made her throat tight. "My mother used to bring me here," she said eventually. "She said the sound of the creek was the land breathing." Nathan turned to look at the water. "That's a good way to put it." "She loved this place the way I've been learning to love it again." Charlotte paused. "I think I came back because of her as much as because of my father." "That makes sense," Nathan said. "We carry our mothers with us." There was something in his voice that made her ask, "Is yours gone 10 years ago?" He picked up a smooth stone and turned it in his fingers. "My father died when I was 14. I grew up working other men's land. My mother worked as a seamstress until she couldn't anymore." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "She was proud," he said quietly. "Not proud in the way that makes people difficult. Proud in the way that made everything she did feel like it meant something. She was the one who made me read," said a man who could think clearly, could survive anything. He paused. "She was right about most things." They sat by the creek until the stars appeared, talking in the comfortable, ranging way that you can only talk with someone when the formality has burned away, and what is left is simply two people who are genuinely interested in each other. Charlotte laughed more than she had in months. Nathan told a story about a cattle drive that had gone spectacularly wrong in Nebraska that made her laugh, until she had to press her hand against her ribs. On the walk back to the house in the dark, she was aware of every inch of space between them, not uncomfortably so, but with a kind of heightened attention that she recognized, with a mixture of exhilaration and alarm, as the early stages of something she had not planned for. Holt escalated in June. A man came to the ranch with an offer $10,000 cash for the 700 acres. It was generous, by any objective measurement. Charlotte did not hesitate. "Tell Mr. Holt the Finley ranch is not for sale," she said, and closed the door. Nathan, who had been standing back during this exchange, looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been concern, or was probably both. "He won't stop," he said. "I know," Charlotte said. "Let him not stop." She was braver in the daylight hours than she was in the small hours of the night, when she lay in her father's room listening to the sounds of the Wyoming dark and thinking about all the ways things could go wrong. The ranch was beginning to be viable. The herd was growing. The fences were sound. They were getting a reputation with the local cattle buyers as a reliable operation, but she knew that Holt had resources she did not. He could be patient in ways that could eventually be devastating. What she did not know then, what Nathan had been carrying quietly since the day he rode to that fence and sat on her top rail, was the full truth of his history with Reginald Holt. 6 years ago, Nathan Sawyer had been hired as foreman at the Clearwater Ranch in Colorado, which Holt had been quietly leveraging for debt through a series of fraudulent loans arranged through a banker Holt owned. Nathan had discovered the scheme, had gathered evidence, had taken it to a territorial judge, and had been 2 days away from filing when Holt's men had broken into the office where the evidence was stored and destroyed it. The ranch owner, a decent man named Garrett, had been ruined. He had sold at a fraction of the value and moved east. Nathan had lost not just his employment but his reputation. Holt had seeded rumors that Nathan himself had been involved in the fraud as a way of discrediting him. It had taken Nathan 2 years and 2,000 miles of distance to rebuild even part of what he had lost. He had come to Wyoming knowing Holt was operating here, knowing what the man was capable of, knowing that when he heard the Finley property was next in Holt's sights, he had a choice. He could have stayed away. He had known, choosing to ride to Charlotte Finley's fence that first morning, that he was walking back into proximity with the man who had destroyed his previous life. He had done it anyway, and he had told himself it was because the injustice needed to be fought, because Holt could not be allowed to continue unopposed, because someone needed to warn this unknown woman coming in from the east about what she was walking into. He had told himself a lot of things. He understood by June that a significant portion of those things were either exaggerations or outright self-deceptions. He understood, specifically on a Wednesday evening when Charlotte came back from the creek with her hair loosened by the wind and laughing at something Cal Drummond had said, that the actual reason he was on this ranch, the reason he had not left even when it became clear that Holt was genuinely dangerous, was standing right there with creek wind in her hair and her whole face alight with laughter. This understanding did not make things simpler. It made things considerably more complicated. Nathan was 31 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade working other men's land, building other people's things, learning in the most concrete possible way what it meant to invest yourself in something and have it taken away. He had developed, as a result, a very careful relationship with attachment. He did not give it easily, and when he found himself giving it anyway, when he noticed the way Charlotte's face went quiet and serious when she was concentrating on something difficult, or the way she laughed unexpectedly at her own jokes, or the way she had asked about his mother with such complete, unguarded gentleness, he found himself uncertain in a way he was not accustomed to being. He told himself to be careful. He told himself the situation was dangerous enough without adding personal complications. He told himself a great many sensible things. He also, on the Thursday after his Wednesday realization, brought her a book from town, a collection of letters by correspondence writers of the American frontier, which he had spotted in the general store and thought of her immediately, and handed it to her without being entirely sure what to say. Charlotte looked at the book. Then she looked at him. Something moved across her face, something quick and luminous that she reined in almost immediately, though not quite quickly enough. "Thank you," she said simply, and held the book the way you hold something that means more than the object itself. The crisis came in July. It came in the form of documents, or rather, in the form of forged documents that Holt produced claiming that James Finley, in the last year of his life, had entered into a loan agreement using the ranch as collateral and had subsequently defaulted. The documents were presented to Sheriff Crane, who presented them to Charlotte with the regretful air of a man performing a duty he had not specifically sought, but was not particularly troubled by either. "This would transfer the property to the Holt Land and Cattle Consortium," Crane said, shuffling the papers on his desk. "You have 30 days to contest it." Charlotte looked at the papers with a cold, focused fury that was very different from panic. "These are forged," she said. "That's a serious allegation, Miss Finley." "It's an accurate one." She picked up the papers and walked out of the sheriff's office. Nathan was waiting outside with the horses. He looked at her face and then at the papers and made the rapid calculation of a man who had seen this particular type of move before. "Holt," he said. "Forged loan documents. 30 days to contest." She handed him the papers. He read them quickly, his expression going very still in the way that meant he was managing something significant. Then he said, "I've seen his work before." And there it was, the opening that allowed the truth to come out. Standing in the street of Redemption Creek with horses at the hitching rail and the summer heat pressing down from a white Wyoming sky, Nathan Sawyer told Charlotte Finley what he had not told her. The full story of the Clearwater Ranch in Colorado, the fraud, the destroyed evidence, the ruined reputation, and the reason he had placed himself deliberately between her and Holt's ambitions. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You came here because of him," she said. "It was not quite an accusation, it was not quite a question." "I came here because of him," Nathan confirmed. "And because I thought someone should warn you, and because—" He stopped. "Because," she said. He looked at her directly with the particular honesty that she had come to understand was the most fundamental part of who he was. "Because I stayed for you," he said. "Those are different reasons. Both of them are true." Charlotte felt the world do something complicated around her. Some internal rearrangement. Some shift in the structure of what she had been permitting herself to think and feel and acknowledge. She had known at some level that existed below rational thought what was happening between them. She had been careful not to examine it too closely, the way you are careful around something fragile. "Nathan," she said, and then could not immediately think of what to say next, which was unusual for her because she generally had words for things. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. This is not the time or the situation for, you stayed for me," she said again, because she needed to hear it again, needed to understand what it meant. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete unflinching honesty of it, did something irreversible to the careful architecture of distance she had been maintaining. "We need to fight Holt," she said, because that was the immediate crisis and she was a practical woman. "Yes, we do," he agreed, because he was a practical man. But something had been said, something that could not be unsaid. And both of them knew it, and both of them walked with the knowledge of it as they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the July heat, the air between them charged with something that was simultaneously terrifying and the most right thing Charlotte had felt in years. Webb was the key. Charlotte had liked the small, bird-like lawyer from the beginning, liked his careful precision and his evident discomfort with what Holt was doing, and the way his ink-stained fingers twitched when he was withholding something he was not sure he should say. She returned to his office the day after receiving Holt's documents and sat across from him with the papers on his desk between them. "These are forged," she said. "You know that." Webb looked at the papers. A long silence passed. "I know your father," he said finally. "I wrote his will. I handled his affairs for 15 years. He would not have entered into such an arrangement. His fundamental philosophy about debt was—" "I know what it was," Charlotte said. "He wrote it to me in a letter once. He said debt was the only thing worse than losing the land itself because it was a way of losing the land twice." She looked at Webb steadily. "Is there documentation, records of his accounts, his correspondence, his finances, anything that would demonstrate the pattern of how he operated, that would contradict these loan papers?" Webb's ink-stained fingers twitched. "I have his papers," he said carefully. 15 years of correspondence and account books, and I may have—" He stopped, looked at the forged documents again, made a decision that Charlotte could see happening in real time behind his spectacles. "I may have something else, something I have been sitting on for some time because I was not certain it was my place to act on it alone." What Webb had was a letter. A letter from a surveyor's assistant who had been hired by Holt 3 years ago to provide falsified assessments on properties Holt was targeting, who had since moved to Denver, and who had written to Webb, at that distance and anonymity, describing the methods Holt used, including the creation of fraudulent loan documents run through a complicit notary. The letter named the notary. The letter was dated and specific. This would need to go to a territorial judge, Nathan said, when Charlotte brought the news back to the ranch. Not Crane, a circuit judge, someone outside Holt's reach. Webb knows Judge Alderman in Cheyenne, Charlotte said. He's willing to write to him directly, but Holt will find out what we're doing. He has people watching Webb's office. Then we need to move before he can act, Nathan said. Get Webb to send his correspondence through the telegraph office, not through the mail, which Holt's men have intercepted before. And we need to keep the actual documents somewhere Holt can't get to them. The satchel, Charlotte said. I'll carry them. He won't move against me directly as long as he thinks he can get what he wants through the legal mechanism. Nathan looked at her with an expression that held a great many things simultaneously. Be careful, he said. He has more to lose if this goes to a judge. That makes him unpredictable. I know, she said, but I'm not giving up this ranch, Nathan. I know you're not, he said, and then quietly, with the directness that was his defining quality, I'm not going to let anything happen to you. She met his eyes. In the warm light of the kitchen where they were standing, with the sounds of the ranch outside, Eli calling something to Cal across the yard, the horses moving in the corral, the weight of everything they had not yet said to each other was so present it was almost a physical thing. You can't promise that, she said softly. No, he agreed, but I can make it my full-time occupation trying. She wanted very badly to step forward the 4 feet that separated them and do something completely improper for 1882 Wyoming. She did not, but it took considerable effort. The next 2 weeks were the most tense Charlotte had spent since arriving in Wyoming. Webb sent his correspondence to Cheyenne by telegraph. Judge Alderman wrote back promptly. He was interested. He had heard previous complaints about Holt. He would come to Redemption Creek to examine the evidence and hold a hearing within the month. The documents, Webb's compiled evidence, the surveyor's letter, Charlotte's own financial records contradicting the fraudulent loan, went into the leather satchel Charlotte carried with her everywhere. Holt, as Nathan had predicted, discovered what they were doing. His response was the move that had always been coming, direct confrontation on the main street of Redemption Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in August, with Charlotte walking to the telegraph office and Nathan beside her. There had been 3 of Holt's men, initially. Nathan had assessed the situation quickly, told Charlotte to keep the satchel and get to Webb's office, and moved to put himself between her and the men. There had been a brief, ugly scuffle, the kind of violence that is more about intimidation than genuine combat, during which Nathan had held his own, and then some, but during which Holt himself had appeared with his Colt and placed it against Nathan's temple while his men subdued the Drummond brothers who had come running from the wagon. Which was where Charlotte found herself, standing in the middle of the main street with the satchel and a gun pressed to Nathan's head, and every soul in Redemption Creek watching from doorways and windows. "Hand me the deed papers," Holt repeated. Charlotte looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. "Don't," he said. She looked at the satchel. Then she looked at Holt, really looked at him, for the first time, as a person rather than an abstraction. He was heavier than she had imagined, with the particular puffiness of a man who had done well for himself and knew it, and had stopped worrying about what he looked like. His eyes were small and flat and completely certain of themselves. He was the kind of man who had never lost anything, and who had therefore never developed the inner resources that loss requires you to build. He was, she realized, afraid. Underneath the gun and the money and the hired men and the flat eyes, he was afraid of Judge Alderman, afraid of Webb's evidence, afraid of the surveyor's letter, afraid of a woman from Boston who had come back to Wyoming to claim what was hers. The violence on this street was the action of a frightened man, not a powerful one. She understood this clearly, and it changed something. "If you fire that gun," Charlotte said, and her voice carried across the street with a clarity and steadiness that surprised even her, "you will hang. Judge Alderman is already on his way to Redemption Creek. The evidence of what you have done is documented and in multiple hands. Sheriff Crane cannot help you out of this." She paused. "This is over, Mr. Holt." A sound came from the boardwalk to her left. Horatio Webb stepping out of his office doorway holding papers. "The judge's wire," he said, at a volume the whole street could hear. "He arrives Thursday." Several of the townspeople who had been watching from doorways stepped out into the street. A cattle buyer named Morrison, the woman who ran the boarding house, the minister from the white church at the end of the road. Not threatening, simply present, visible, refusing to be only witnesses. Holt's gun hand did not waver, but something in his face shifted. The calculation was happening. Nathan could feel it in the way the pressure of the barrel changed, could see it in Charlotte's face as she watched Holt make his accounting. "Nobody wins if you fire that gun," Charlotte said quietly. "Not you, not me, not Nathan. We all just lose something that can't be gotten back." She held the satchel out slightly, not in surrender but in the gesture of someone who is no longer afraid. "This is evidence. Evidence that was gathered legally, witnessed by a licensed attorney, and has been transmitted to a territorial circuit judge. There is nothing you can do to that satchel now that changes what has already been put in motion." The flat eyes blinked. For a moment nothing moved. Then Holt lowered the gun. It was not a graceful moment. He said something to the men holding the Drummond brothers who released them. He put the Colt back in its holster with the controlled movements of a man preserving what dignity he had left. He looked at Charlotte with something that was almost, she thought, a kind of bleak recognition. "You haven't won yet," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "But I will." He walked away. His men went with him. The street let out a breath it had been holding. Nathan turned around and looked at Charlotte, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on it before, something wide open and undisguised and completely unguarded in a way that was almost shocking on a face she had come to associate with careful, precise control. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I think so." He put one hand up briefly to the side of his head where the gun had been pressed, a checking gesture, then lowered it. "That was, I know," she said. "You should have been terrified." "I was terrified," she said, "but it seemed like the wrong moment to let him know that." Nathan looked at her for one long, complete moment, a look that contained everything, that left nothing safely categorized or carefully filed. And then, in the middle of the main street of Redemption Creek, Wyoming, in full view of the emerging townspeople and Horatio Webb and the cattle buyer Morrison and the minister from the white church, he reached out and took her hand. Just that. Just her hand in his, warm and certain and real. It was, she thought, the bravest thing she had ever seen anyone do. Judge Alderman arrived on Thursday, as his wire had promised. He was a formidable man in his late 50s, with the particular gravity of someone who had spent decades navigating the legal borderlands of a territory where the laws were still being made, and the powerful were still, in many cases, accustomed to being their own law. He set up the hearing in the town hall, a narrow building that also served, on Sunday mornings, as additional church space, and he examined Webb's evidence with methodical thoroughness over the course of a full day. Charlotte presented her case clearly and without drama, which she sensed was what the judge respected. Nathan gave testimony about his previous experience with Holt in Colorado, which the judge received with careful attention, and a number of sharp, specific questions. The notary named in the surveyor's letter was sent for, and arrived looking like a man who knew exactly what was about to happen to him, and confirmed the details of the fraudulent document scheme with the deflated honesty of someone who has decided that cooperation is the only remaining path. Holt had a lawyer, a slick, articulate man from Laramie, who did his best with an increasingly limited hand. By the end of the second day of the hearing, it was clear even to the lawyer that the hand was not going to improve. Alderman's ruling came on Saturday morning. The fraudulent loan documents were declared null and void. Reginald Holt was remanded to territorial custody pending charges of fraud, deed manipulation, and conspiracy. The Finley Ranch was confirmed in full legal ownership of Charlotte Finley, free and clear of any encumbrances. Outside the town hall in the August sunshine, with the hearing concluded and the documents in her hands, her real documents, her father's name and her name, and the 700 acres of Wyoming land that had cost more than she had anticipated to claim. Charlotte stood for a moment and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Nathan came to stand beside her. They were quiet together, the way they had become good at being, the way that had stopped feeling like silence and started feeling like its own kind of conversation. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at the papers in her hands. Then she looked out at the street, the false-fronted buildings, the church at the end, the particular blue of the Wyoming sky. Then she looked at Nathan. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I came to Wyoming to claim a piece of land," she said carefully. "That was the plan, and I have done that. And the land matters to me. It matters to me more than I expected, more than I can easily explain, because it's my mother's land and my father's land, and in the last few months it has started to become mine." She paused, but somewhere in the middle of fixing fences and fighting Holt and sitting by the creek, she stopped, started again. "The ranch is not the only thing I came to find here," she said, "even if I did not know that when I left Boston." Nathan had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness of someone managing something difficult, but the stillness of someone who is listening with their whole body, every part of their attention gathered to a single point. "Charlotte," he said. "I'm not finished," she said, because she needed to finish this, needed to say it completely for the first time. "You stayed for me, you told me that, and I want you to know," her voice caught, then steadied. "I stayed for you too. Not that I was going anywhere, but everything that I built courage for, everything I defended, I was defending partly because of you, because you believed in this place and in me, and I could not let either of those things go." The August sun was very bright. A wagon moved at the far end of the street. Somewhere nearby, a horse moved in its harness, a small domestic sound that made the moment feel more real, not less. Nathan took a step toward her. "I have spent," he said carefully, as though choosing words for something that required precision, "the last several months trying to be sensible about you, trying to remember that the situation was complicated and the timing was wrong and I had no business." He stopped, started over with the directness that was his true mode. "I am not successfully being sensible," he said. "I haven't been for a while." "Good," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "I have been unsuccessfully sensible since approximately late April," she said. "It would be a relief not to have to do it alone." The smile that moved across Nathan Sawyer's face was not like any expression she had seen on him before. It was wide and unguarded and young, in a way his face did not usually look. The face of a man letting go of something he had been holding very carefully for a very long time. He reached out and cupped her face in both hands, the calloused warmth of his palms against her cheeks, and kissed her there on the street of Redemption Creek with the sun at full height, and the townspeople going about their business and the documents of her ranch still in her hand. It was not a particularly proper kiss, by the standards of 1882. It was, she thought, absolutely and completely perfect. The autumn that followed was the most vivid Charlotte could remember. The work of the ranch continued, the fall gathering, the cattle sale, the winterizing of the buildings and fences and water systems. Nathan was as capable and serious and precise in his work as he had always been, but now there was a new ease between them, a quality of simple happiness that ran underneath everything else they did, like water running under the ground, invisible on the surface, fundamental to everything that grew. They talked every evening. They had always talked, but now there was nothing held back, no careful management of what was said and what was left unsaid. Nathan told her the full history of his life, the Colorado years, the betrayal, the long, slow process of rebuilding, and she received it the way she received everything about him, with complete attention and without judgment. She told him about Boston, about the years of teaching, about the loneliness of being competent at the life you were living without quite believing it was the one you were meant for. He listened with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. "Did you think you would find it?" he asked once. "The life you were meant for." "I wasn't sure I believed in that idea," she said honestly. "The life you're meant for." It seemed romantic in a way I couldn't quite justify. And now, she considered him across the table where they were sitting, the lamp between them, the Wyoming night outside the window. "Now I think it's less about destiny and more about recognition," she said slowly. "You recognize something when you find it. You recognize it in your body before your mind catches up." "What did you recognize?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "This," she said simply. "All of it. The land and the work and the creek," and a pause. "You." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The lamp made a small, warm circle in the dark. "I recognized you that first day," he said. "On the fence rail. You got out of the wagon and said something sharp and clever," and he shook his head with a quiet laugh. "I thought, this woman is going to be nothing but trouble." "And was I?" "Constantly," he said. "And it was worth every bit of it." In November, Nathan asked Charlotte to marry him. He did not make a production of it. That was not his way. They were sitting by the cottonwood tree at the bend in the creek, on a cold, clear afternoon, the leaves long gone and the water running slate-gray below the bare branches. She had a coat bundled around her. He was sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, and he simply turned to her and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life on this land with you. I want to build this place into something we can both be proud of and grow old in. I want to marry you, Charlotte." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that a question?" she said. "Yes," he said, "a very hopeful one." "Then yes," she said, "an extremely certain one." He kissed her there by the cottonwood, with the cold November air around them and the creek running below and the bare branches overhead. It was nothing like the summer kiss on the main street, quieter, more private, deeper in some way that had to do with all the weeks between then and now, all the evenings by the lamp and the mornings on the fence line, and the particular accumulated intimacy of two people who had learned to trust each other completely. They were married at the small white church at the end of Redemption Creek's Main Street on the first Saturday of December, 1882. The minister who performed the ceremony was the same one who had stepped out onto the street during Holt's confrontation, a man named Reverend Hartley, who had a warm and straightforward approach to faith that Charlotte appreciated. The Drummond brothers stood at the back and were quietly emotional about it, which Charlotte found unexpectedly moving. Horatio Webb attended and shook Nathan's hand with both of his ink-stained ones, and told Charlotte that her father, who he had known well for 15 years, would have been glad. She thought about her father during the ceremony, about the long silence between them, the letters that had said too little, the reconciliation that had not happened in time. She let herself grieve it for a moment, cleanly and without apology, and then let the grief settle into the place where it lived and turned her full attention to Nathan, who was looking at her with that wide, unguarded expression that still, every time she saw it, made her feel as though the world had opened up. She said her vows clearly and with complete conviction. He said his in the same way, no performance, no embellishment, just the true and serious weight of a man who meant every word he said. The winter was their first winter together on the ranch, and it was harder than Charlotte had anticipated and better than she could have described. Wyoming winters in the 1880s were not gentle. The cold was absolute and structural, the kind of cold that gets into the walls of a house and requires constant tending to keep at bay. They learned each other in the close quarters of wintertime, the particular intimacies of two people sharing a home, morning fires and meals, and the distribution of tasks, and the way Nathan made coffee strong enough to make her eyes water, and she made it, she would admit, somewhat too weak for his taste, and they compromised on something in the middle that satisfied neither of them entirely and somehow became, in the way of small domestic negotiations, one of her favorite things about their mornings. They had a bookshelf that grew throughout the winter. Webb sent books occasionally, and the general store received new stock on the mail wagon. And Nathan made a trip to Laramie in January and came back with 6 books and a new lamp, and the particular look of a man who had enjoyed himself independently in a way that suggested he was also a person outside their marriage, which Charlotte found she loved rather than threatened by. She wrote letters to her aunt in Boston, explaining what she had done and who she had married, to the school where she had taught, formally resigning a position she had already effectively resigned, to 2 friends, old and close, long letters about Wyoming and the land, and Nathan careful letters that nonetheless must have conveyed something significant, because the replies she received back were enthusiastic in a way that suggested she had communicated more than she had meant to. In February, Charlotte realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Nathan, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted the 2 days to herself first, 2 days of carrying this extraordinary fact in her body and her heart before it became something shared, something discussed, something that existed in the world beyond her. On the evening of the 2nd day, she told him while they were sitting at their usual places at the table. Nathan went very still. Then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, something entirely new, as though the face she knew was rearranging itself to accommodate a feeling too large for its usual arrangements. His eyes, usually so controlled and precise, went bright. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said softly. He stood up from the table, which was unusual for him in emotional moments. He was not a pacer, generally, and then sat back down, and then reached across the table and held both her hands in both of his. "Are you," he seemed to be having some trouble with the sentence. "Are you well?" "You're well." "I'm well," she assured him. "I'm very well. We need to—" He stopped, started over. "There's a doctor in Laramie, Dr. Hennessy. I've heard he's good. He could come." "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "I'm not fragile," she said, "and we have several months before anything requires a doctor's attention. You have time to think clearly before planning." He looked at her. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh that was also visibly something else, something she didn't have a word for but recognized in her body as happiness so full it had nowhere to go but out. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He came around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and held her with his arms around her and his cheek against her hair, and they stood there in the kitchen in February with the winter outside the walls and the lamp making its warm circle, and the whole future arranged differently than it had been an hour ago. "I want to do this right," he said quietly, against her hair. I want to be the kind of father mine couldn't be. The kind who stays and builds and is there." "You will be," she said with complete certainty. "It's not something I have any doubt about." Spring came again. It came differently than the previous spring. Charlotte saw it through different eyes, aware of the world in ways she had not been before, more attuned to cycles and seasons and the fundamental business of life and time. The land came back from winter with its usual extravagance, the grass greening and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the particular quality of morning light in Wyoming spring that was so clear and so clean it almost hurt to look at. The ranch was doing well. Better than well. Nathan had negotiated contracts with 2 cattle buyers in Laramie that gave them predictable income through the summer, and Eli Drummond, who had turned out to have a particular gift for understanding cattle health, had moved into something closer to a ranch manager role that freed Nathan for the larger operations. They were building something real. Charlotte could feel it in the way the land felt under her, no longer provisional, no longer something she was borrowing until Holt took it, but genuinely, solidly hers. Holt himself was in Cheyenne facing territorial court proceedings. The fraud charges carried serious weight, and the network of corruption he had built, the false documents, the bought officials, the methods described in the surveyor's letter, was being methodically dismantled. Webb wrote to Charlotte periodically with updates. She read them with interest and then went back to her work, which felt like the appropriate relationship to have with the matter. Nathan planted a kitchen garden in the spring, her idea, his execution, their shared labor on a Saturday afternoon when the weather was good and neither of them had anything more urgent. They argued pleasantly about the best placement for the tomatoes and reached a compromise that satisfied both of them reasonably well and produced, in the end, more tomatoes than they knew what to do with. Webb came to dinner in May. He sat at their table and ate Charlotte's cooking and drank Nathan's coffee and talked about the territory. The changes coming, the railroads expanding, the settlement pushing further and further into lands that had been otherwise occupied for centuries. He spoke of the injustice of the displacement of the peoples who had lived on these lands, with the quiet frustration of a man who had observed it helplessly for a long time. Charlotte listened and thought about the land her family had owned, had claimed more accurately, and about what claiming meant and what it cost and who paid the costs that the claimers didn't. "We're going to do this right," she said, though she knew the we was larger than she and Nathan, larger than their ranch, larger than anything she could easily act on. "The land deserves to be understood, not just owned." Webb looked at her over his spectacles. "Your mother used to say something similar," he said. She had not known that. It sat with her, warm and significant, for several days. On the 1st of June, the Drummond brothers built an addition to the main house, 2 new rooms, one of which would serve as a nursery. Nathan was involved in every stage of this construction with a focused and detailed attention that made Eli Drummond say, on the 3rd day, "You know we do know what we're doing, Mr. Sawyer," and Nathan say, "I know. I'm watching anyway," and Charlotte coming out with water for the workers to laugh so hard she had to set the water down. In August, their son was born. It was a long labor, managed by the midwife from Redemption Creek, Mrs. Holcomb, a capable and reassuring woman of considerable experience, and by Nathan, who was not in the room for the actual birth because that was not done, but who sat on the other side of the door for 11 hours without moving except when Mrs. Holcomb came out to update him, at which point he listened carefully and thanked her with the focused courtesy of a man whose every available resource was going toward not unraveling. Charlotte, inside the room, was aware of him through the wall. It helped somehow, the particular certainty of his presence, when Mrs. Holcomb finally opened the door and Nathan came in. Charlotte was sitting up with the baby, their son, their first child, a boy with dark hair and her mother's nose, or so she thought, though she could not quite be sure yet, and Nathan stopped in the doorway and looked at them both with an expression that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and Nathan held him with the careful, reverent attention of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding, and looked at his son, and was quiet for a very long time. "James," he said finally. It was a question. Charlotte felt her throat go tight. They had talked about names. He had suggested her father's name, and she had said she would think about it, and she had thought about it at length, about the complicated layers of feeling she had about her father, about the distance and the reconciliation that had not happened and the love that had been expressed in land and in legal documents rather than in words or presence, and about whether naming a child for someone was a form of forgiveness or a form of continuation or simply a form of love. "James," she confirmed, "James Nathan Sawyer." He looked up at her over the baby's head, and she saw on his face every layer of what he was feeling, the joy and the grief and the love and the responsibility and the specific, enormous weight of becoming a father. And she loved him with a completeness and a certainty that felt like the whole of her, like the land and the creek and the cottonwood tree and the kitchen garden and the books on the shelf and the coffee in the morning, like everything that was real and built in hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We built this together," she said. Young James Sawyer was loud, opinionated, and absolutely magnificent. These were Charlotte's assessments, delivered privately to Nathan and to no one else, because she understood that one was not supposed to be openly smug about one's child's magnificence. Nathan, for his part, was openly smug about it to everyone who would listen. This surprised Charlotte somewhat, given that he was not generally a demonstrative man by public standards. He turned out, in the specific matter of his son, to throw public restraint entirely to the side. He could be found, on any given morning, explaining James to the Drummond brothers, to Webb during his periodic visits, to Morrison the cattle buyer, and on one memorable occasion to the minister of the Redemption Creek Church, with the enthusiasm and detail of a man who cannot fully believe that this specific thing exists and is his. Charlotte told him once with affection that he was embarrassing himself. "Absolutely," he agreed, "and I have no intention of stopping." James was 8 months old the following spring when Holt's trial concluded in Cheyenne. The verdict came by telegraph guilty on multiple counts of fraud and land conspiracy, sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. Webb sent a letter with the details, and Charlotte read it at the kitchen table and folded it neatly and set it aside. Nathan came in from outside and looked at her face. "The verdict? Guilty," she said. "5 years." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said finally simply, and the word contained 6 years of his own history with Reginald Holt, the destroyed evidence, the ruined reputation, the long miles of distance and the slow rebuilding. And Charlotte heard all of it in the single word and did not try to add anything to it, because some things were exactly the right size already. "It's done," she said, the same words she had said in the street of Redemption Creek the day of the hearing. "It's done," he agreed, the same way he had agreed then. James called from the other room, a demanding, cheerful sound that functioned as their son's standard mode of communication. Nathan went to him with the easy readiness of a man who had, in 8 months, become completely fluent in the language of being a father. Charlotte listened to the sounds of them together, Nathan's low voice and James's enthusiastic responses, and felt the deep-settled happiness of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. In the summer of 1884, they hired 2 additional hands as the cattle operation expanded, and Charlotte began teaching a small informal school on Wednesday and Friday afternoons for the children of the ranch families in the surrounding area. She had not planned to return to teaching, but the need was there, 3 children with no access to school within reasonable riding distance, and when the need was there, Charlotte's inclination was always to meet it. Nathan built a second room onto the barn that served as a schoolroom, with proper light and a wood-burning stove for the cold months. It was, Charlotte thought, possibly the most romantic thing anyone had done for her, though she recognized that the category of romantic was more expansive than she had once believed. She told him so. He looked pleased in the particular understated way that was his version of delight. "A schoolroom is romantic," he said. "You built it because it was what I needed," she said. "That is the definition." He considered this. "All right," he said. "Then yes, extremely romantic." She had 6 students by autumn. They were between the ages of 6 and 12. The Drummond boys' younger siblings, 2 children from the Morrison family, and a girl named Rosa from a family who had settled 3 miles to the east. Charlotte taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a certain amount of practical natural history, because she believed that understanding the land you lived on was as important as any book learning. The students were, on the whole, delightful. Charlotte had forgotten how much she loved teaching, the particular satisfaction of watching something abstract become concrete in a child's mind, the moment of recognition in a face, the way learning was visible in people who had not yet learned to hide it. Nathan brought her coffee to the schoolroom on the afternoons she taught. He was too tactful to stay. He understood the classroom was hers, but he brought the coffee and left it on the step, and she found it there when she was finished, still warm, every time without fail. Christmas of 1884 was the first one that felt complete. Charlotte's aunt from Boston came west to visit, a formidable woman named Ruth Alderton, who had raised Charlotte for 14 years, and who had written, upon receiving Charlotte's letter about the marriage, A letter back that was simultaneously approving and bristling with the particular energy of a woman who had strong opinions about everything and intended to make sure they were known. Ruth arrived by train and was met at the station by Nathan, who was aware that this meeting was in some way a test, and who handled it with the calm, direct courtesy that Charlotte had learned was his reliable response to situations of social pressure. He shook Ruth's hand and carried her bag and said the right things at the right moments and drove her to the ranch in the wagon, while she examined everything about him with the comprehensive efficiency of a woman who had made many assessments in her lifetime and did not waste time on social performance. By the end of the first evening, Ruth had decided she approved. Charlotte knew this not because Ruth said so, she did not quite, but because of the specific way she spoke to Nathan after dinner, with the ease and the directness she reserved for people she had decided were worth her full attention. After Ruth went to bed, Charlotte looked at Nathan and said, "She likes you." "I think so," he said in the tone of a man who is quietly relieved. "She's not easy to win over," Charlotte said. "I know," he paused. "She raised you. That makes her opinion very important to me." Charlotte looked at him for a moment, at this man she had found in Wyoming and built a life with and loved more completely than she had believed a person could love another person and still be entirely herself, and felt the particular impossible fullness of a life that had exceeded what she had imagined it could be. "She did a good job," she said softly. Nathan smiled. "She did a magnificent job," he said. Ruth stayed for 3 weeks, during which time she became deeply attached to James, expressed several pointed opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen, demonstrated a surprisingly thorough knowledge of cattle operations that she attributed to having read extensively on the subject, and told Charlotte privately on the morning of her departure that Nathan Sawyer was the kind of man who was worth the considerable trouble of Wyoming. "High praise," Charlotte said. "It is," Ruth agreed. "Do not waste it." Charlotte did not intend to. Spring came again, the third spring since Charlotte had stepped off the Union Pacific platform and found a man sitting on her fence. The ranch was genuinely thriving now, 140 head of cattle, a small but well-regarded reputation with the buyers in Laramie, the school running smoothly, the house warm and full of the accumulated evidence of two people building a life together with attention and care and genuine love. James was 2.5, walking with tremendous determination in all directions, and talking with enthusiastic if not always intelligible energy. He followed Nathan everywhere possible, which Nathan bore with the obvious deep pleasure of a man who could not believe his luck. Charlotte sometimes stopped what she was doing just to watch the two of them together, Nathan explaining something about the horses in his serious, careful way, James listening with the concentrated attention that was, she had realized with a start, completely his father's expression translated into a 2-year-old's face. She was pregnant again by late spring. This time she told Nathan the same evening. They had learned in 2.5 years that there was no value in sitting with things alone when they could be sat with together. He received the news with the same particular stillness as the first time, and the same subsequent rearrangement of his face into something too large for its usual arrangements. And then he pulled her close in the kitchen and said into her hair, "Thank you for this life." "We made it," she said. "We made it," he agreed. "Together." Their second child was born in November of 1885, a daughter this time, who arrived with considerably more speed and efficiency than her brother had, and who immediately made clear, in the first hours of her life, that she intended to have strong opinions about everything. They named her Margaret, for Nathan's mother. Nathan received the name with a silence that Charlotte understood, because she had come to understand his silences as clearly as his words. This particular silence was the one he had for things that mattered completely, and that he could not quite speak. "Margaret," he said finally, with the reverence of someone who has been given back something precious. "Margaret Finley Sawyer," Charlotte confirmed. He cried, briefly and privately, turning away to do it with the reflex of a man who was not accustomed to tears, and Charlotte did not make him feel observed. She simply held the baby and waited for him, and when he turned back, she handed Margaret to him and watched his face do every remarkable thing it did when it was holding his children. The letter from Denver came that winter. It was from the surveyor's assistant who had written the letter to Webb that had helped bring Holt down, a man named Calder, who had subsequently built a legitimate surveying practice in Colorado and who wrote, with a kind of careful formality that suggested he had thought about writing it for some time, to express his hope that the matter had been resolved in Miss Finley's favor, and to say that he had thought often about the courage it had taken to contest Holt through legal means. Charlotte wrote back a long letter. She told him the outcome, told him about Nathan, told him about the ranch and the school and the children. She told him that what he had done writing that original letter, providing the evidence that made the case, had mattered profoundly, and that she hoped he was building something good. He wrote back. They corresponded occasionally after that, not closely, not often, but in the way of people who are joined by a shared history they both want to see mean something. The years built themselves, one on another, in the way that years do when the life is right, not without difficulty, because no life of substance is without difficulty, but with the quality of days that are genuinely lived, genuinely felt, genuinely shared. The school grew to 12 students and then to 18, and the Wyoming Territory's Board of Education sent an inspector who told Charlotte, with evident surprise, that the school at the Finley Sawyer Ranch was producing students who tested significantly above the territory average in reading comprehension and mathematical reasoning. Charlotte thanked him with the pleasantness of a woman who is not surprised by this information and is choosing not to say so. Nathan was offered a position as a county land assessor in 1887, a recognition of his encyclopedic knowledge of the territory's properties and his unimpeachable reputation for honesty. He thought about it for a week and then declined, because the ranch was what he had built, and the ranch was what he intended to keep building, and honesty was not something he was interested in monetizing at the expense of what he actually wanted to do with his life. Charlotte, when he told her, felt the particular warmth she had for him when he made decisions that were entirely in keeping with who he was. James started school with the other children in the fall of 1887 and immediately made clear that he found arithmetic tedious and that he intended, at the earliest possible opportunity, to work with the horses full-time, a position which both Charlotte and Nathan declined to discourage while also holding firmly to the arithmetic. Margaret, at nearly 2, began expressing views about the arithmetic situation as well, largely by taking James's side, which she did about everything with the absolute loyalty of a small person who has identified her primary ally. The cottonwood tree was still there, still enormous, still growing beside the bend in the creek. Charlotte and Nathan went there sometimes in the evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet and the Wyoming night was doing its extraordinary thing with the stars. They sat in the grass the same way they had sat there in the early months, with the same easy silence and the same ranging, honest conversation, except now the conversation included things like the growth rate of the cattle herd and James's views on arithmetic, and what they thought Margaret was going to be like when she was old enough to articulate her evident determination to run everything. "She's going to be formidable," Nathan said one evening. "She already is," Charlotte said. "She's exactly like you." "I'm choosing to take that as a compliment. It is the highest compliment I know how to give," he said, with the complete and simple sincerity that was the mode she loved best in him. She looked at the creek. The stars were very bright. The cottonwood was a dark shape against the sky, familiar and permanent, the way things become when they are loved for long enough. "I used to think I was a person who didn't quite fit anywhere," she said. "In Boston I was too much of something too direct, too practical, too uninterested in the things that were supposed to matter. Out here I was too much of something else, too Eastern, too educated, too female to be running a ranch. She paused. I spent a long time not fitting. And now, he said, she thought about the question carefully the way she thought about things that deserved careful thinking. Now I think fitting was the wrong thing to look for, she said. Fitting is about conforming to a shape that already exists. What I found here was, she searched for the word, recognition. The land recognized me. You recognized me, and I recognized all of it. She looked at him. That's better than fitting. Nathan was quiet for a moment. In the way that meant he was taking something in fully before responding. When I was on the Braddock Ranch in Wyoming, he said slowly, after Holt destroyed the Clearwater situation and I was trying to rebuild, there was a period when I nearly left Wyoming entirely. Nearly went further west, California maybe, somewhere I could be completely unknown, start completely fresh. What stopped you? I don't know exactly, he said. Something that felt like not stubbornness exactly. Something more like knowing that running was not the same as surviving. He paused. And then I heard about the Finley property and I thought, this is the one. This is the place and the situation where I can do something that matters. He looked at her. I was right about that. I was just significantly underinformed about all the ways in which it was going to matter. Charlotte laughed softly. Then she leaned against him, her shoulder to his arm coming around her, and they sat under the cottonwood in the Wyoming night with the creek running below them and the stars doing their slow, enormous work overhead. Nathan, she said. Charlotte, he said, I'm very glad you sat on my fence. He pulled her closer. So am I, he said, every single day. The morning was coming already, a lightning at the edge of the sky, the particular gray-blue that preceded the rose that preceded the gold, the same sequence that had been happening over this land for uncountable years before Charlotte Finley came back to it and would happen for uncountable years after. But in this moment it was theirs, this land and this light and this life. Inside the house, James and Margaret were asleep. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. The fence lines that Nathan and Charlotte had built and repaired together ran in every direction, holding the shape of the thing they had made. Charlotte held Nathan's hand under the cottonwood tree, and Nathan held Charlotte's hand, and the creek ran between its banks, and the Wyoming dawn came in from the east like a promise that had already been kept. Everything was settled. Everything was real. Everything was exactly, completely, and permanently theirs.